This is what happened to Judas after he betrayed Jesus. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. When the evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12 disciples, and while they were eating, he said, "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples were sad, and one after the other mentioned, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord." Jesus replied, "The one who dipped his hands in the bowl with me will betray me." Then Judas, the one who betrayed him, said, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." Jesus answered, "You have said so." Do you remember this passage in the Bible? That was the night Jesus had his last supper with his disciples. You know how the story went. Judas left there and went straight to the Pharisees. He got some money from them and betrayed Jesus with a kiss. However, the story many people ask is, what happened to Judas after he betrayed Jesus Christ? His story has been a topic of debate for many centuries, with some people arguing that Judas was not a betrayer, but in fact, he was chosen for the fulfillment of the prophecy that Jesus would be crucified. Well, in this video, we will dive into the story of Judas Iscariot. Although the Bible didn't tell us much about the origin of Judas Iscariot, or even how Jesus called him to become one of the 12, we have 2 facts about him that you probably didn't know until now. Firstly, do you know that all of Jesus' disciples were from Galilee, except Judas? Well, there is evidence to suggest that he was not originally from Galilee like the other apostles. The surname Iscariot has been linked by scholars to a town located in the south of Jerusalem called Kerioth. This would mean that even though he was also from the tribe of Judah, he was still sort of an outsider among the other disciples. Now, do you recall any mention in the Bible where the other disciples discriminated against him because he was different from them? Of course not. This is why it's not obvious or mentioned explicitly in the Bible that Judas was from another town. Jesus called him friend, just like the others, and the disciples never treated him with discrimination just because he wasn't from the same town as them. In fact, they regarded him highly and trusted him the most. This leads to the second fact you probably overlooked about him. Judas Iscariot was a learned man. You probably already know that he was the treasurer for the group, but you should be aware that he wasn't just appointed treasurer without qualification. Judas was an accountant, and when he left his work to follow Jesus Christ, just like the other 12 apostles, he was appointed as the treasurer. So, rather than treat him with discrimination because he was from a different town than them, the other 11 disciples trusted and respected him highly. Now that we've shared some facts about his origin, let's discuss his life as an apostle and what we can tell from the Bible. When Jesus began his ministry, he decided to choose 12 disciples to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. So he began by making his selection carefully. Among these 12 was Judas Iscariot, the man who betrayed him. Over the centuries, there's been an over-familiarity with the concept of the 12 disciples, and their significance is often understated. The disciples were the closest people to Jesus throughout his ministry. Even though Jesus had a family, the Bible recorded that his family didn't believe in him, and instead, they thought he was crazy. However, the 12 disciples he handpicked himself followed him everywhere he went. They ate the same food he did and traveled through cities with him as he preached the gospel. Not only were the 12 close to Jesus, but they also had many privileges that weren't available to the rest of the multitudes, did not enjoy. Let us consider 3 main privileges exclusive to the 12 disciples only. The first one is the explanation of the parables. The primary reason Jesus taught in parables was for ordinary people not to understand. Yet the Bible recorded several instances where the disciples would ask Jesus when they were in private, and he would give them proper explanation to these parables. This helped them to understand more about the heavenly kingdom than every other person. Another privilege the disciples enjoyed was the fellowship with Christ after his resurrection. After his resurrection, Jesus spent 40 days teaching his disciples and preparing them for the life they were about to experience after his ascension. Of course, at this point, Judas Iscariot was no longer in the fold. Lastly, they witnessed his ascension. You can check our last video on 5 wonderful things that happened after Jesus' resurrection to see our explanation on the significance of witnessing Jesus' ascension to heaven. These privileges should show you just how important the disciples were and how much Jesus cherished them. Judas was one of these 12 disciples, and even among the chosen 12, he was one of the most respected in the group. The Bible recorded that he was the treasurer for the group, and this shows just how much the rest of the disciples trusted him. How do you think he lived as an apostle? The answer is simple, yet you might find it shocking. Judas was just like the other 11 disciples of Jesus. Nothing special, nothing peculiar. In the book of Luke, chapter 9, in verse 1, the Bible recorded how Jesus called the 12 disciples and gave them power and authority to perform signs and wonders. And they did. The 12 disciples, including Judas, went about preaching the gospel and performing miracles. This is proof that he didn't join the 12 disciples as an unbeliever. That wouldn't have been possible in the first place because Jesus handpicked the 12 himself. He was as much a believer in Christ as Simon Peter was, and he had as much authority as Andrew, Thomas, Matthew, Philip, and every other disciple within the 12. The question now is, if he was such a righteous man as an apostle of Jesus, what went wrong? It was a simple case of not being able to resist temptation. If Jesus Christ could be tempted by the devil, how much more a mere disciple? The book of James, chapter 1, verse 14 says, "But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed." When he first tempted Jesus, he knew that Jesus was hungry and needed food. But Jesus was able to resist the temptation and rebuke him. It is quite apparent that Judas Iscariot, just like billions of people around the world today, loved money. However, when it was his turn to be tempted, he simply couldn't resist it. Since he had access to all that money, he couldn't help but take some of it for himself. In no time, he began to see the entire treasury as his personal money, even though it was meant for the ministry. After all, nobody audited the accounts. Judas's greed was especially obvious in the book of John, chapter 12, from verse 4 to 6, when a woman named Mary anointed Jesus' feet with an expensive oil. When he saw the oil, he couldn't help but imagine how fat his purse would become if he had gotten the money instead. So, even though he was a righteous man and an apostle of Jesus at first, he allowed his love for money to blind him to the things that really mattered, and he became deaf to all of Jesus' teachings. The book of John, chapter 6, verse 70 reads, "Jesus answered them, 'Did I not choose you, the 12, and one of you is a devil?'" The next verse, verse 71, tells us, "He spoke of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, for it was he who would betray him, being one of the 12. At this point, Judas was still living as an apostle and had not betrayed Jesus. Yet, why did Jesus refer to him as a devil? Well, let us take a look at the things he did, which proved Jesus' point that he was indeed a devil. During the Last Supper, Jesus told his 12 disciples that one of them would betray him. It sounded unbelievable to them because they couldn't imagine any of them doing such a thing. But at the same time, they knew that Jesus' words were true. So they all became curious and wouldn't stop pestering Jesus about who the betrayer would be. Even Judas was asking as if he was innocent. But he wasn't innocent. Let's return to the events that happened before the Last Supper. You already know how Judas became blind to the things that mattered because of his love for money, and how he had become deaf to Jesus' preachings. Eventually, nothing else mattered to him other than money, and he kept looking for ways to get more. During his teachings, Jesus continued preaching the gospel to the people and clarifying on the sins that could ruin their chances of making heaven. Judas most likely felt attacked by these teachings because his conscience pricked at him whenever he heard Jesus say these things. However, instead of repenting of his sins, he became angry at Jesus, and in no time, he saw Jesus as an enemy, preventing him from his goal of attaining earthly riches. This led him to the conclusion that it would be better if he handed Jesus over to the Pharisees, who had been looking for ways to lay their hands on Jesus. Prior to this conclusion by Judas, Jesus had always evaded every means the Pharisees tried to use to get at him. So Judas went over to the Pharisees and asked how much they would pay him to give them Jesus. It was a good deal for the Pharisees because they knew that he was an inside man, and what better way to infiltrate than to get an inside man on your side? They offered him 30 pieces of silver, which was probably a lot of money at the time, and the deal was set. Let's return to the Last Supper. When Jesus made the statement that one of them would betray him, he already knew what Judas had done. After the supper, Judas went out to meet the Pharisees, while Jesus went out with his disciples to pray. You know how the rest of the story went. The betrayer brought the army of the Pharisees with weapons to arrest Jesus. Since it was night, the people had trouble identifying Jesus, so Judas had to identify him with a kiss. The men arrested Jesus immediately, and that prophecy was fulfilled. Over the centuries, some have argued that Judas wasn't a betrayer, but instead was chosen to play that role for the fulfillment of the prophecy. However, that argument is as foolish as saying that the people who killed Jesus were chosen for that role just for the fulfillment of the prophecy. The main reason many people argue pointlessly in this manner is because they do not understand the significance of a prophecy, especially in the case of Judas Iscariot, the betrayer. When the prophecy was made that someone would betray Jesus, it wasn't because the person would be chosen to do that. Jesus made that statement because he is all-knowing. In his omniscience, he knew that someone would betray him, so he said it before it happened. That's how prophecy works, especially when the prophecy comes from God. God is omniscient, so he knows what will happen before it does. Therefore, when he says something will happen, it is because he knows that it will happen. When Jesus named Judas at the Last Supper as the one who would betray him, he wasn't choosing Judas to do the job, he was merely exposing the truth. Judas Iscariot wasn't chosen to fulfill any prophecy. He was driven by his greed and obsessive love for money. He lusted after money so much that Jesus became a nuisance to him, so he found the best way to get rid of Jesus and make money while doing that. The question many people have and don't know the answer to is, what happened to Judas after he betrayed Jesus? The answer in one word is regret. Right after Jesus was taken away and his money was handed to him, Judas regretted what he had done. When he got the money he wanted so badly, it didn't make him feel as good as he had expected. Instead, he felt bad for betraying his friend. He had spent the last 3 years with Jesus, traveling, eating, and living together. Jesus called his disciples his friends, and he treated them as friends, not servants. Judas realized that there was more to life indeed than earthly riches. He went straight back to the Pharisees to return their money, but they told him the transaction could not be reversed. Even when he gave the money back to them, they wouldn't take it back because they knew it was blood money. The moment Jesus was delivered to them and they paid for him, that money became cursed. At the end of the day, none of them wanted to share the curse with him. Cursed as he was, Judas couldn't live with himself. He didn't have the courage to ask for forgiveness or bear the shame of living as the man who betrayed Christ, so he unalived himself. The Bible gave 2 different accounts of how Judas died, or so you think. But the 2 accounts were merely 2 people's description of the same event. And the answer to the question you've been asking is a combination of these two reports and a little bit of science. While the book of Matthew described how Judas ended his own life, the book of Acts gave a graphic description of how his body was found. With the money he got, Judas bought a piece of land, and there he hung himself. How then did they find his body, with his insides spilled out as described in the book of Acts chapter 1 verse 18? Well, that's where science comes in. It's no news that a person's body slowly becomes bloated right after they die, especially when no care is provided to the body, just as Judas's was hanging out in the hot sun. The bacteria inside his body would be actively breaking down tissues and cells while producing gas due to the metabolism. This tissue decomposition compromises the integrity of the skin, making it easy to tear or break at the slightest intrusion. The account in Acts tells us that Judas' body fell to the ground. This is likely due to the branch he was hanging on breaking or the rope hanging him snapping. The force at which his body hit the ground caused his decomposing skin to break easily, which led to his entrails gushing out. Unlike the other disciples who died as martyrs for the gospel, Judas Iscariot died on the field he purchased with the money he sold Jesus for. Gruesome as this may sound, this was what happened to Judas after he betrayed Jesus. Eventually, he died before Jesus was crucified. Is the story of Judas Iscariot the saddest one in the Bible? Or do you sympathize with how he ended his life? As we ponder his fate, we're confronted with the enigma of human frailty and the depths of remorse. Judas, once a disciple, now etched in history as the ultimate betrayer, leaves us grappling with questions of forgiveness and redemption. His story is a somber reminder that even those closest to the divine can succumb to temptation and despair. Yet, in Judas's tragic journey, there lies a glimmer of empathy, a recognition of the complexities of his inner turmoil and the weight of his remorse. So, as we reflect on Judas's legacy, let us not rush to judgment, but instead pause to contemplate the profound intricacies of his story. In doing so, we may find a deeper understanding of the human condition and the enduring quest for grace and redemption in the face of our most grievous mistakes. Thank you for watching this video. Your time and attention are greatly appreciated. We hope you found it informative, entertaining, or inspiring. If you enjoyed the content, please consider liking, sharing, or subscribing to our channel to stay updated with future videos. Your support means the world to us. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Do feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below.